Thank you very much for joining us today. This marks the final event in IPPO's Innovations in Evidence series, in which we've been exploring different aspects of evidence for policymaking. My name's Sarah Chater. I'm the Principal Investigator for IPPO, the International Public Policy Observatory. And I'm really excited about this event because it definitely taps into my nerdiest tendencies. What we want to do in the art and craft of knowledge mobilisation is dig into how evidence use is enabled for policy. How do we get research evidence, expertise, insights into the policymaking process? We know that this is a really difficult thing to do. There are all sorts of structural and cultural barriers, from mismatched incentives between academia and policymaking, to different timelines, to institutional complexity, to just not having the time to do it. So research policy engagement doesn't just happen. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes energy, and it takes an awful lot of specialist skill sets to understand what evidence is needed by policymakers and how evidence can be used to inform policy decisions. Knowledge mobilisation sounds like a bit of jargon, but it's really the stuff that happens at the interface of research and policy to get research knowledge into policy development and decisions. So it's a crucial part of that interface. But what is it? What does it entail? How does it work? How do we continue to advance it? How do we recognise the practice of knowledge mobilisation as a specialism in and of itself? To my mind, it's a complex cocktail of skills and competencies. That might be communication skills or project management skills or relationship building. It's about creating space and opportunities for dialogue, about convening and integrating different forms of expertise, about exploring the applicability of research insights to policy challenges and to potential solutions to those challenges, and much, much more. And all of this at the moment is functioning as a bit of an invisible infrastructure. It's an essential underpinning of research policy interactions, but it's all too often overlooked, undervalued, and under-resourced. So today is about shining a light on knowledge mobilisation, what it is in practice, and why it matters to inform public policy and ultimately to deliver societal benefit. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by a panel with brilliant experience and insights on this. We're going to hear from each of them in turn, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion and a Q&A. Please do add your comments, your questions, your reflections in the Q&A function as we go along, and there'll be plenty of opportunity, I hope, for discussion. I'd first like to introduce Kate Morris, who leads Campus Engage on behalf of the 7 Universities of Ireland and the Technological University of Dublin. And her work there includes managing a strategic programme around engaged research and innovation for societal impact. And I think it's fair to say that Ireland has really sort of led the way in recognising this as a crucial part of what universities should be doing. So, Kate, over to you.
Hi, everyone. What an honour and a pleasure to be here with this group. And I sincerely mean that. Like, anything that brings our two nations together and that we can share insights, information is a bonus. So I'm grateful to be here. So I'm going to just speak a little bit about Sarah's asked me to speak about, I'm not going to use slides, and I'm really going to be pithy because I think as agreed, this is about bringing the audience in and asking the questions. It's not a top-down lecture. So firstly, the Irish Universities role, what Irish Universities Association. So there's only 7 universities in Ireland. Yes, and this association brings together the 7 presidents, and we're looking at foresight, advocacy, and making sure the universities in Ireland are fit for purpose. That's our role. I've actually 20 years now, Sarah, sadly, experience in the system, and I've worked with government departments, I've worked with the universities for the last 10 years, and I've worked with civil society organisations. So I'm going to look at the why very briefly, and then I'm going to look at the how. So how do we do this, and how do we enable it? And I'm going to try and cover multiple perspectives from my own experience. So that's the university researchers' experience, the policy official or policy makers' experience, and the funders' experience. And my job over the last years has always been about engaged research. So bringing the research beneficiary into the research practice and delivery, planning for impact together. So when I talk about the researchers, I'm kind of conflating that a little bit about our societal partners, like whether that's practitioners, the public in general, small, medium enterprise, whatever it is. So Ireland, where are we in this journey? I'm going to briefly chat you through. So since 2022, okay, so in the last kind of 2.5 years, really, we have gone into 5th, and we have delivered a series of initiatives to better position university research for public policy making. Okay, so we have a new impact strategy, new research strategy called Impact 2030. Bang in the center of that is this whole agenda that universities must be delivering on this. Same as industry engagement, same positioning. Okay. In addition, the department we have in Ireland, we have a Department of Further Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science. Yeah, long title. But within that, they have set up and launched a new evidence unit within government. And this evidence unit has created a civil service research network. Okay, so this is part of government creating the essential core architecture to make this happen. And I'm part of an advisory group and a government advisory group to help make this happen at the university system. But we've been working on co-designing a framework. Okay, so an all-inclusive societal partner or key stakeholder framework on the implementation of this and how to. Equally, we have a new Research and Innovation Act launched or signed off in the last couple of months, and we have a new agency in Ireland for research and innovation. Like UK Research Innovation, it's called Research Ireland, and bang in the middle of their role and remit or of this new agency permitted by this act is the better mobilisation of research and innovation. And finally, we've just put in place a new Chief Scientific Advisor within government. Okay, so why am I telling you this? Because this is all about the global picture and specifically about the European picture and what is happening. There's a fundamental change that is happening in policy for research and innovation. Okay, so rapid kind of, I would say, advancement of political polarization, European isolation on a global kind of geopolitical scale. And this is now reflected in EU policy and EU research and innovation policy. Okay, so this direct threat to democracy, the spread of disinformation, the need to protect our technological and energy sovereignty. We can see this now in European research and innovation budget and pumping more money into FP10, Horizon FP10 or FP9, and due to happen in FP10 for challenge-based, mission-based funding. Embedded right in the middle of that is bringing policymakers into the research process. And again, to inform, so using research to inform European and as trickle down Irish policy. And again, we can see this kind of European alliance of universities, so coming together, working together as a university networks across Europe. This is a huge initiative, and I would argue a really important initiative for Europe, for Ireland, for the UK. We're delighted, thrilled to see our UK partners back at the table across Horizon Europe agenda. Is fundamental to Ireland in particular because we have so many brilliant partnerships previously in European projects. So I'm going to talk briefly now about the how-to, the enabling of this. How do we make this happen? We can see in Ireland, using it as a case study, that we have this infrastructure which has been advanced and we can write beautiful policy. However, how we implement that policy within the universities is very tricky, and we need to get real, and we need to, so a policy without a significant budget, I would argue, is always a wish list. So I'm going to try and talk to this quickly about our 4 key kind of stakeholders or I hate the term stakeholders, but I'm going to use it here. So our research community within universities, our policy makers within government, funding agencies, and those social partners. And so we have to have incentivizations and carrots to make this happen and realize long-term outcomes and impact of research for innovation, with the mobilization of research for public policy and policy innovation. So in Ireland, very clear, we did a big study on this over 2024, and we can see wonderfully we have strategy, research innovation strategy. Yes, it's in there. It's in professional award and promotion criteria. We need skills. We need to build the skill base of our university researchers. So they actually have those key skills that Sarah talked about, understanding the vital role of policymakers, their timelines, effective engagement with societal partners, and so on. We need impact metrics. We need university researchers desperately need to understand what are the needs of policymakers. Yeah, we need to align that up correctly. Researchers need time allocated to them to do this work. And we need some kind of a mentoring system where the superstars or the celebrity researchers often called upon need to mentor the next up and coming generation. So I'd argue as well that the skills piece to make this happen for researchers needs to happen when students come on campus, first day, bums on seats. They need to understand whether you're a physicist or a social worker, that your work has potential to influence public policy, and the how-to of that is vital across all curricula. And then for policy officials, we really need them to be publishing regularly their research and innovation needs and aligning this better with funding calls, and making sure those calls are timed timed adequately for researchers to have the ability to respond to them. And that aligns also with public tendering processes, making sure these are fit for purposes, fit for researchers' purposes. And again, other big challenges are, academic promotion is still aligned with publication. So our policy officials need to be referencing and an information system where we can go in and we can also understand the contribution of our academic community to policy. So look, that's a very micro kind of assessment of researchers, of policymakers, and of course funding agencies need to be all networked in. And I'm going to complete this, or a close out on these 4 key points on the enablers, right? So this architecture, we need a core funded, stable architecture to connect researcher academic excellence with policy needs, funding agency calls and criteria. And this can happen. We don't need multiples of different initiatives. We need a core central architecture aided by in-person communication, knowledge brokerage, knowledge exchange, but also using AI. I was delighted to see a UKRI call for evidence for policy in AI. But also, again, culture within universities, I'll say specifically, needs to, we need strong leadership, I would argue, to be disruptive, to change cultures and attitudes, to ensure that policy can be implemented. And fundamental to all of this is trust. Trusted relationships, attitudes between policy officials and researchers and funding agencies, and a kind of an agreed, a new Magna Carta for this university system, where this evidence for policy is really embedded in the core role and responsibilities of universities, to address and really to begin to implement EU, Irish national policy to better mobilise research for public policy.
That was absolutely brilliant, Kate. What a great overview of what's been happening in Ireland, but also some of the challenges, I suppose, in turning ambitions into reality. Thank you very much. We're going to turn now to Ben Hepworth, who is based in the Evidence and Partnerships Hub at the Ministry of Justice and leads on fostering collaborations with researchers to facilitate the exchange of evidence and expertise. Ben has a specific interest in the application of transdisciplinary research methods to evidence-based policy and practice. And the Evidence and Partnerships Hub in the MOJ, for those of you who've not come across it yet, is another really innovative team looking at both the ambitions and the challenges of really getting evidence into the heart of government policy making. Ben previously worked in a similar role within DWP, so he knows his way around the UK government. And he joined the Government Operational Research Service after completing a PhD in applied maths at the University of Leeds. Ben, over to you.
Thanks very much for having me along. And I will apologise in advance, but I've already given Sarah a heads up about this. I'm going to spend a whole slide bashing the word policy and policymaker. Sarah's laughing, so hopefully that's fine. So I'm going to cover the 3 main points that were in the Eventbrite description, because I thought they were quite a good 3 things to sort of cluster around what I'll be talking about. So the role knowledge mobilisation plays in the research policy ecosystem, how and where it can support evidence use, and then a few reflections at the end on skills, practices, and that kind of thing. So first of all, I thought I'd start by trying to define what's meant by the research policy ecosystem. So I don't really think there is a good definition of it or a description of it out there. But the best thing I know is this map by Annette Boas and Catherine Oliver from Transforming Evidence. So This was produced following their fellowships in the Government Office for Science, and it sort of seeks to conceptualise accountability, funding, and then the production of evidence and advice within what's termed the government science advice system. But I think you can kind of loosely interpret it as, you know, the general functionings of research and policy within government. So hopefully you can see what's going on the screen, but if not, then I'd urge you to look at the map in its full detail and look at the wider work that feeds into it, so you can properly digest it. So that's where I sit specifically within MOJ, within the analysis directorate. I'll go on to say a little bit more about what my team does later. But I guess the main takeaway from looking at this map and thinking about what we mean by a research policy ecosystem is just how complex it is, the system. And I don't think this even captures all the interactions. And if you look around the edge, there are multiple entry points for researchers within this system. And knowledge mobilisers and knowledge mobilisation are key to ensuring, you know, those entry points exist. The actual entry operates smoothly, and this whole system functions effectively. So that's my attempt to describe the system we're talking about. I'm going to assume that everyone knows what research is, so I'm not going to describe that. But I mean, I'm going to focus on what we define as policy, because like I've already hinted at, I think it's used quite sloppily. So inside government, it's got quite a specific meaning, and it's a dedicated profession of individuals working on developing policy options, supporting policy decisions, but it's supported by myriad other teams across an organisation. So there's analysis that generates, appraises, assesses evidence that forms the foundations to underpin policy. There's finance for working out what it might cost, strategy for setting the what you might want to achieve in the longer term and how you might get there. And then there's operations or practice teams that crucially actually implement policy on the ground and make sure, or at least attempt to make sure it does what it says. But externally, all of this is just bundled together and called policy, and particularly in the media, often, and there's no regard whatsoever for the different teams, stages, people involved. So policy often ends up portrayed as everything that an entire government department does. Relatedly, the term policymaker is also sloppy. If someone says that, I immediately, that isn't my job, because I have a defined job. Someone who works in policy has a defined job. Someone in finance has a defined, so I just think it's quite sloppy language. And within a system of thousands or tens of thousands of people, by saying policy and policymaker, you're actually only describing a tiny percentage of the people within that system. So I don't think this gets acknowledged enough, and I think it's really important to make that distinction, especially if you want to engage with government regarding academic research. You need to understand where the entry points are, who you're actually trying to access and speak to. And I think as knowledge mobilisers, we need to do better to help researchers understand the system, understand the entry points, and understand who they're actually trying to contact. As Sarah said, I work in MOJ, so I'm coming at this entirely from the perspective of a government department. Another layer to all of this is, you get people talking about how they've responded to a parliamentary inquiry and then they're hoping to impact policy. Parliament isn't government. It's a completely different stage in the process. We're talking about policy scrutiny, not policy formation. It's very different. It's an entirely different branch of the whole operation of the state. The third one being the judiciary, which I'm not even going to get into the complexities around that. But I guess the point I want to make is that there needs to be greater clarity over where research is seeking to feed into, where that impact is seeking for that to be. So the perspective that I'm coming at this from is from working as an analyst in government. So as Sarah said at the start, I joined the Government Operational Research Service, which you probably haven't heard of. You might not have even heard of operational research itself. If not, have a Google. It's got quite a fascinating history dating back to the wartime. And fun fact that the first ever government chief scientific advisor was an operational researcher, Solly Zuckerman. But the point to make is that the government has a number of analytical professions under the banner of the analysis function. We're headed up by Professor Sir Ian Diamond, who's the national statistician, and as well as operational research and stats, that includes social research, economics, data and digital, government actuarial profession, and the geography profession. I think that's all of them anyway. But hopefully the diagram and the quote on the screen, I'm not going to read it out, makes it obvious why I'm telling you this. And you can see the parallels between academia and academic work and the work of the analysis function. So there's a sort of rubbish description. I always like to think of it as like a mini academia within government. It functions quite similarly in terms of the way projects are run. And analysts from most of these professions work alongside teams right across government departments. Obviously, departments are structured quite differently, but they all have analytical teams. So in MOJ, there's around 500 of us, and we're a natural entry point for research and researchers within our analytical teams, because we're both conducting research and generating evidence. So there's parity there in terms of the type of work that's going on and the way it can feed into decision making. Zooming in a little bit more, so my team sits within analysis directorate, and more widely we're in policy group. And our role is to support colleagues across the directorate with academic engagement. So whilst we're based in analysis directorate, by extension, our analysts, they're working with all the teams I mentioned before, whether that's policy, strategy, finance, or at the sharper end of things, operations. So we were established in 2020 and started from a blank sheet of paper to develop a strategy and structures that could help MOJ engage with external evidence and expertise. So I've listed some of the sort of key machinery on the screen there in the two blobs, whether it's primarily internally facing or externally facing, or whether it's in the, that golden bit in the middle where the fun stuff happens. So internally, a lot of the activities, it's in sort of aims to support colleagues to understand what academic engagement can look like, how to go about it. There's networks and structures to find the right academics, or conversely for academics to find us. Externally, we've made it clear what research we're interested in through the publication of our areas of research interest, and then we've promoted that through articles, blog posts, podcasts, speaking at events like this. And then we've established structures that provide a basis to actually engage with academics in a meaningful and impactful way. So we've got a monthly online academic seminar series for colleagues to join. We organise bespoke academic roundtables. And then finally, we've partnered with projects and programs that allow research co-creation. And where that's most impactful is via academic placements and secondments, so giving researchers a chance to actually come into MOJ and work alongside us. So I'm wrapping up now, but in doing all this, I've learned quite a bit about what works in the world of knowledge exchange. So I've just tried to summarize some of that here. So the first one being around expertise. So it's good to focus on what an academic's USP is, and not to be constrained by, disciplinary boundaries or where they currently sit in a department or an institution, and always look to try and go beyond them. So I guess just because someone is currently, conducting research in a particular area or a particular topic, it doesn't mean they have to. What's taken for granted in one particular discipline could be groundbreaking in another. And we've found in the past that it's always worth giving it a go, even if it, might seem a bit left field. So the best example I can give of that is working on a social policy modelling project. We brought in an astrophysicist to support us, because at the heart of it, the statistical techniques that we were using to simulate the expansion of the universe were just as well equipped to policy simulation. Next one being networks. So there's a whole host of ways, to actually network and be part of a network. So that the areas of research interest that I mentioned, they're a good way to find a way in and find a departmental hook for your research. Many of them contain an email address as a way to get in touch. So that's a good first step. Wider networks within academia, like the University Policy Engagement Network, UPenn, are a fantastic partner in both the work we do and many departments, and almost like a first point of call when looking to reach out. I think it's important as well, once you've actually built connections, to not let them dwindle and keep in touch. So even when there's not an immediate piece of work that you're supporting, it's generally just always interesting chatting to people. At least I find that, and you never know what might come up. So just keeping that human element to it as well, I think, is really important. Timing is key. So if someone already has findings, then I guess think about their key messages, how you disseminate them. But it's important, not to wait until the end of a project. Obviously, once you've got findings, there's kind of limited scope for people to comment on what might be going on underneath. So more to think of it as a two-way thing rather than a one-way thing, and possibly think about getting some advice throughout the course of research rather than just waiting until the end. and thinking about the bigger picture as well, and what might be on the horizon. When might government be looking for certain evidence? And then no time is too early, really, within that. If you get input at the start, then you can ensure it, you set off on the right research trajectory. Or even for new research seeking funding, that's not too early either. Departments can often provide letters of support for research and partner right from the beginning. And then just finally touching on mechanisms. So I've spoken about it previously, but what seems to work best in a lot of this is what the mechanisms that allow co-creation over sort of linear approaches where you're just trying to push research in. So there are more and a growing number of initiatives that allow researchers to spend time inside government departments. So we're a partner on the UKRI policy internships that allow students to have a 3-month placement, and then the UKRI policy fellowships for early to mid-career researchers that allow a 12 months secondment as part of that. And they give a fantastic insight into the functioning of a department, the role of evidence analysis, research as part of decision making, and really put researchers at the heart of that. So we've seen fantastic results from them. We've seen a lot of success from the approaches that I've described here. And we've recently had a case study published by the Government Office for Science, in case you're interested in reading that and going into a bit more detail on some of this. It links to a few other blog posts that we've written over the years that reflect on this journey. You can sort of see how it's built up over time. And I'll just end by saying it is worth stressing that it is a journey. None of this is sort of immediate. It's taken 5 years for us to get to the point we're at now, and every single sort of different instance has been different each time. But yeah, if you'd like to read more, then I can send links out afterwards. But thank you for listening.
Thanks very much indeed, Ben. That was brilliant, and a great overview both of the work of your team, but also that the insight that you've gained through practice over the years. We've got lots of questions coming through in the chat now, or the Q&A rather, which is great. Please keep them coming. We're going to turn now to our final speaker before we open for discussion. Dr. Hannah Durrant is a Senior Research Fellow and also Programme Director at the Wales Centre for Public Policy. She leads WCPP's work on community wellbeing, generating relevant and impactful evidence for the Welsh Government and for public service and community leaders on mobilising community action to meet need and enhance social connection. She also leads WCPP's research and practice on knowledge mobilisation and evidence-based policymaking, and has been doing some really interesting work trying to dig into what this practice looks like, what skills are involved. So over to Hannah.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. And I've got a few slides to share. Hopefully this might be quite a valuable sort of follow on from the other speakers. There's always a benefit and a challenge to going at the end, because you're never sure whether or not everyone's going to say what you've said, so you don't know how to kind of integrate it, but at the same time you don't have to cover so much ground because people have already said a lot of really good things. So I just wanted to again say thank you for inviting me here and for letting me speak. It's something, the art and craft of knowledge mobilisation is something we spend quite a lot of our time thinking about and trying to capture and improve within our centre. And I want to take a little bit of a minute to say what we do, but then actually I think following on maybe a little bit from what Ben said, drill into some of the kind of more practical practices and crafts of knowledge mobilisation from our, well, research experience, kind of interaction with other people as well. So just to start with, just to say a little bit about the centre. The Wales Centre for Public Policy is an evidence centre based at Cardiff University. We're funded by the Welsh Government, by the Economic and Social Research Council and by Cardiff University to support decision makers in Wales, Welsh Government and public services across Wales access and apply evidence to inform their decisions. And we also have a research function within the centre, actually a research culture within the centre that continually seeks to improve and innovate how we do that by reflecting on what we do, understanding the impact of what we do, and talking and engaging with other people who do things similarly to us in terms of trying to support that kind of translation and transference of evidence into policy at various. I'm feeling very told off by just talking broadly about policy. I might have to do that, Ben, I'm afraid, just because it's a short a shorthand, but I agree with your point. And actually, a lot of the time we're working with groups of decision making groups of people and organizations around a topic, around a problem, around an issue for Wales, or in fact for a lot of people. So that's what we do. And what I wanted to start with is, it kind of goes back to some of the things that Kate was talking about. Why do we do this? And I think inherent to what everybody was saying is that there is an ideal of having better decisions supported by evidence, but it's a pervasive and persuasive argument, but examples of that are quite rare, because evidence rarely kind of falls into policy in a neat and linear way that just kind of meets the moment of decision making in the right place, and is sort of bolt-onable to the way of thinking and the kind of context of that decision making collective at that time. And it requires active processes of communication, translation, and it requires that to be engaged with what's going on in that kind of policy making space, and it needs to be able to connect that back to what evidence exists to help support that decision making, and that evidence doesn't sit in one place. So it's a kind of many to many connective function that's needed, and that's quite difficult, quite complex, and so we've kind of gone through processes of research and reflection on how that's done. How do you connect the sources of knowledge and evidence and expertise to the kind of decision making in context? And I've got a fairly clunky kind of diagram that's trying to say, you know, there's evidence, there's expertise, there's knowledge in multiple forms that requires mobilizing to a context in which you've got policymakers, professions, policymakers in different roles, professions and practices coming together to try and solve a problem, and so in solving that problem have some kind of impact on our society, on our economy, on our democracy, and the way we live. So we've done quite a bit of research. We've looked at what we do. We've read about what other people say they do. We've spoken to people and captured the stories of people who do knowledge mobilization. And I think one important thing is that knowledge mobilization is probably more of a kind of an action rather than a person. I think there are a lot of people who sit, as Ben was kind of saying, who sit in a range of organizations with a range of functions who are mobilizing knowledge. It's not necessarily this sort of discrete third group of actors who mobilize knowledge and do nothing else, and who interact with people who are either discreetly making policy or discreetly producing evidence and knowledge. So, but underpinning this kind of this practice of knowledge mobilization, there's a set of kind of key features from what we found from reading and talking to other people, and underneath that there are sort of processes to realize these features of knowledge mobilization, and then kind of below that, I think the kind of actual lived experience of craft of how that's actually done. So what I'm talking about, I think, is quite a micro level of kind of zooming in on that practice. So firstly, knowledge mobilization is relational. It's about developing, sustaining, convening, sharing relationships between research, knowledge, expertise, and the various decision-making places of policy and practice through both formal and informal mechanisms. And so what we've read about a lot is kind of practices of setting up communities that talk about these policy and practice issues, of advisory groups, even as Ben was talking there about quite opportunities for really quite embedding expertise in decision-making teams. But more informally, knowledge mobilization and knowledge mobilizers have continuous ongoing kind of one-to-one interactions across multiple teams and individuals within that kind of policy field, and often seek out ways to borrow networks that exist. So where are people already coming together to talk about this as an issue, and how can you piggyback on those networks and use those networks to help communicate and coordinate knowledge, flows of knowledge across and between policy and research and other forms of evidence. And the crafts involved around building trust and rapport, which often really rests on how you are able to position yourself as a knowledge mobiliser, being clear about what your role is, understanding the dynamics within those teams and within those networks that are forming around policy issues. How do you seek to understand and listen and engage with where people are at, rather than coming in with another perspective? And to facilitate interactions across those dynamics. So these are the crafts involved. They're really hard to kind of capture and codify. They're not tangible, but this is what our kind of reflections and interactions are finding. Also, knowledge mobilisation is inherently contextual work. So it's engaged and involved in the contexts and cultures and capacities for evidence use across knowledge production and utilisation. A lot of the kind of formal literature talks a lot about kind of building skills and capacities and utilising sort of mechanisms like evidence advocates, ensuring you work upstream of the research being produced so that you understand its utilisation, and working out loud to understand how research is kind of being produced in relation to policy problems and the kind of options for tackling those concerns. But a lot of the craft is around then building contextual pictures, understanding what the constraints are, where are the opportunities, working upstream and out loud so that you enable evidence ownership, knowledge ownership across research producers, knowledge producers and users, and ensuring that research is produced as usable by design from the beginning, and also paying attention to who is represented in these settings where decisions are made, not necessarily one big homogenous group of people making a decision, but the various sites in which ideas are being generated and options for how you solve problems are being discussed and debated and deliberated. How do you diversify the engagement in those spaces? And then knowledge mobilisation is integrative. It's about bringing together various forms of evidence, knowledge, tacit, professional, experiential, local, contextual knowledge, and creating evidence mosaics. That's the term that we've coined or has been coined and that we use. It's inherently, again, often people talk about working collaboratively, working co-productively, responsively and iteratively, and iterating evidence synthesis. So it isn't just, here's the evidence, you know, find a way to plug it in, but it's looking at how evidence works. If it doesn't work, how do you iterate back to say, what can you do to help me understand this dynamic or this aspect of the problem? So yeah, the craft is in how you bring all of that together, and importantly, I think, in process transparency, so you don't lose those evidence threads. Where has this knowledge come from, and can you reflect back in what is produced as something on which you could base decisions, where that evidence has originated from and how it's been assembled? So some transparency around where this knowledge comes from. And then thinking about impact of evidence on policy as a cycle. So how you build from one engagement to the next engagement, rather than thinking about, we do some research, we plug it into policy and it has an impact, but how you build, utilising those relationships to build that kind of ongoing iterative cycles of impactful connections between research and policy in policy areas over time. So I think that's it from me. I'm sorry if I've spoken for far too long. I wanted to just kind of finish though by saying this is clearly not straightforward. It's possibly not a bolt-on to a policy role or a research role, but it's also not necessarily a discrete separate space. It's inherently relational. And so I think thinking about this as happening in a black box, separate from both research and policy, taking one thing, alchemically changing it for another place without doing that in the round is also probably quite problematic. I think I'll stop there. Thank you, Sarah.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Hannah. I mean, I think that is about the best attempt I've ever seen to try and codify the practice of knowledge mobilisation, which often feels slipperier the more you try to define it and talk about it. Thank you all very much for such stimulating presentations. We've got some really great questions in the chat, and I'm going to start with one of the earlier ones, which I think is really important, and which, Hannah, you've touched on a little bit, I think, which is, do we risk overlooking the needs of wider publics and communities if we focus only on mobilising knowledge to address policy needs? So how do we do that in a way that also integrates civil society? Would any of you like to respond to that, or all of you? Kate?
In Ireland, we have worked hard to embed a concept of engaged research, and that includes all societal beneficiaries of research in the research process. So historically, it's very much focused on industry engagement, jobs, bottom line, spin outs, licenses, etc. And we can see now this engaged research process embedded in our Research Act, in our funding call criteria, in university research strategy. So the engaged research process is fundamental to this, is bringing those beneficiaries into the planning of any research project for the implementation and the planning for societal impact piece. So it's understanding the needs, the situation, the necessary inputs or intended outcomes of research with those beneficiaries, whether that's public patients, whether it's practitioners, whether it's young people, that they're deeply embedded in the research process. And you can see this is really how the big challenge-based calls in the EU and our own Irish challenge calls are now insisting on this in order to access funding. So it's not ideal, I know, because we need to fund those society partners as well adequately, and the technicalities of that aren't always ideal, but it's been the bread and butter of our work in Ireland, is how to better embed societal voice in the research, the involvement of society in the research agenda.
Brilliant, thanks, Kate. Ben, do you want to come in?
I would just say I agree generally that it's probably not sort of sufficiently covered by most stuff. I can just highlight one thing that we've done to try and overcome this via one of our flagship projects called Data First, which is a large admin data linking program that we're part of. We've got it's called a user representation panel. So it comprises representatives from organisations that work directly with or on behalf of people experiencing the justice system, whether that's criminal, civil or family. And this panel actually works alongside our teams to make sure so their needs and interests are reflected throughout the programme, so that, data points aren't just data points, they actually reflect people and the meaning and the intentions behind them. So I can send more information about that if anyone's interested in that specifically, but that's the best example I have of it.
Thanks, Ben. Hannah?
Yeah, I think it's really important to talk about knowledge mobilisation as not just about research evidence mobilisation. It is really important that people taking decisions in the public interest have access to forms of knowledge that can support that decision making. And I think it's important that we ensure that the investment in higher education research is able to be mobilised to support that endeavour. And I think, Kate spoke about that and spoke about the value of the importance of that in terms of countering disinformation and ensuring that we've got good functioning democracy. But I don't think it's just about mobilising research evidence to policy. I think part of the reason why research sometimes doesn't feed well into policy is because the framings of decision makers in a room, policy isn't made in a vacuum of ideas, that people have ideas about the kind of way the world is and the way it should be. And that comes from multiple sources. It comes from engagement with civil society. So I think it is about understanding and bringing together the forms of knowledge that exist on the thing we're trying to do, and finding ways to connect and convene those different forms of knowledge. And that's why I think the practice of knowledge mobilisation is so important. And as you said at the beginning, Sarah, is often overlooked for how, this isn't just a simple act of putting a research paper in front of a decision maker. This is about trying to bring together various ways of understanding the thing we're trying to do, and trying to understand how those forms of knowledge can be mobilized to support a good decision and a good outcome to some end. And so it's overlooked. What we overlook is the kind of the work of that connective tissue to bring all of that together and to assemble it. And it often means bringing people around a table. It doesn't mean doing that talking for them. It means convening the spaces in which knowledge can be exchanged. And I think we need to shine a greater light on those everyday crafts and practices of knowledge mobilisation. Otherwise, we risk in the abstract not really understanding how that functions, how much time and resource it takes, and how important it is, and that it isn't a bolt-on to a different kind of job, if that makes sense.
Absolutely makes sense. Thank you. Those are very thoughtful answers, all of you. We've got some good discussion going on in the Q&A, just for anybody who's not seen it, picking up on Ben's point about being specific with your language. So there are some suggested alternatives to just the blanket use of policymakers worth having a look at. I've definitely used any and all of them, I think, in my time. And I think the point I took away, Ben, because you're absolutely right. It's like talking about all academics as if they're one tribe as well, is that we have to think specifically about both our specific audiences, but also the contexts. So if we're looking to work, say, with civil society organisations that are engaged in the policy process, we can't talk about them as government officials, for example. We can perhaps talk about them as policy actors. So I think it's a reminder to all of us that there isn't actually a one-size-fits-all term, and we should be a little bit more precise and a little bit more cognizant of our context. And as Hannah was reminding us, that contextualisation is a really critical aspect of doing this successfully. Just sort of staying with that theme a little bit, I wanted to pick up on a question from Jonathan Brecken around the potential impact of different disciplines or different policy areas. Does that change the way we approach knowledge mobilisation? Does it change the practice? Any thoughts on those sorts of disciplinary and topical differences? Ben, I might push you on that just because you were emphasising the importance of not being constrained by disciplinary boundaries.
It's unfortunate you've asked me that, because I was frantically Googling the number of people in the policy profession versus the operational delivery profession, and I completely actually missed what you were saying. But I'm not trying to fob Jonathan off, but the internet says there's about 33,000 people that work in the policy profession and over 200,000 that work in the operational delivery profession, who you would completely alienate by even referring to as policy, because they might work in a prison, a job centre. So I don't think even the word policy in it is quite right. What was your actual question there, Sarah? Just to
It was, does knowledge mobilisation change according to either the discipline you're working in and or the policy topic or policy area you're working in?
Yes, I think it's always like situation specific, but generally I found the best thing to do is to hide as much of that as possible from the people that need to, and just try and focus on what actually is required of those within, the situation or the system to actually achieve the mutual aims that you're trying to. And I think that's where the role of a broker comes in, by understanding the two camps, as it were, and then making what needs to happen seamless. So whether that's translating language or like I said, overcoming barriers because enough about what each side are trying to achieve. That's typically what I've found the best. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And Kay, I just wondered if you might want to reflect on that, thinking about the engaged research strategy and how much that needs to take account of different disciplinary areas.
Yeah, I mean, I have a database, an abundant database of examples of how our researchers have worked with policy officials to inform whether it's kind of keeping older people living at home for longer, or dementia policy, or whatever it is. But and above, the number of offshore wind turbines Ireland needs to meet its targets and transition to energy plants and wind energy plants. I think that there's an issue here around researchers understanding and their skills and core competencies in the translation of scientific evidence for public policy, and the differentiation between advocacy work and that comes up a lot in talks and chats, in sessions in universities. And I think there is absolutely a role for both, but I do think this is a different activity. So in that sense, I think some researchers, whether it's modelling for flu vaccines for the health service executive, or it's trying to better fund care workers in community projects, there is there is a different, Ben, you correct me on this, but there's a different attitudinal change, attitudinal perception of and use of research evidence in public policy making. Of course, it all depends on the political piece of this. You know, if a politician wakes up and there's a front page story on care workers not cared for in West Ireland, you know, there's a knee-jerk reaction. We need more evidence on how we're delivering on this agenda. So it's so intertwined, I think, in the political piece, whereas we do very much need to differentiate the policy officials or the policy makers or like whatever, and the political piece. In Ireland, it's the Oireachtas versus the civil service role and their remit. Yeah, but that's all in my mind. That's all about developing core competencies. The Joint Research Centre in the EU has a phenomenal training program that I took a number of years ago, and we've set up a whole train the trainer course in Ireland on how to better inform researchers to mobilise their research for public policy in an effective way. And it's really deeply understanding Ben's role, or you know, various policymakers across the system, their role and their timelines and their pressures and the changing context of their role on a day-to-day basis.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kate. I'm going to move on just because I'm keen we answer some other questions. There's a heads up to all of you. There've been a few comments and questions in the chat, some really interesting examples of practice around the UK and internationally. It's well worth everybody having a look at. But also a few questions about how do we really know what works in terms of knowledge mobilisation? How do we know we're having an effective impact on policy? Do any of you have some top 3 or even a top 1 approach or technique that you might use? I'm going to let you think about that while we also take another question around how best to respond to wicked problems. So where evidence is messy, where solutions are part of a long-term process, and I would add, I think, where the challenge is sort of shifting all the time and involves multiple stakeholders and actors. How do we best undertake knowledge mobilisation in that very messy context? Hannah, can we come to you first?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that might speak a bit to actually what we've been saying about 2 things, about where decisions are made and who is involved in those decisions, and avoiding kind of sort of simple terms of policymaker and researcher, and understanding, I think, that if you're concerned with a particular area, it's about finding the people who share those concerns, and it's about understanding where are decisions taking, where is the political kind of drivers and actors, but who else is involved? Where are the other analysts, other knowledge holders? What parts of civil society are engaged with this debate? Where is the lived experience? What is the kind of collective of people and organizations in this space? And then I think it is about that kind of question about actively diversifying voice. So I think if your principle is to bring knowledge together and to ask the question, what is the sum of knowledge that is needed on this topic, then you're looking to, and part of the job of a knowledge mobilizer, I think, is to convene across these spaces, to convene across these discussion groups. You could imagine it in terms of bringing people around a table, and your table gets too big. Actually, maybe there are multiple tables all talking at the same time, and the job of the knowledge broker and knowledge mobilizer is to walk between those tables and to slowly move people into a room together more. So I think that's partly how you tackle wicked issues. I think it's also about saying, we acknowledge that there are wicked problems, but then we say, well, we need a quick 6-month chat between you and we can solve this problem. So let's understand impact as a cycle. Let's understand change. If the problem is inherent and tricky, let's take a long-term approach to how we seek to solve it. So let's do work, move forward, but not look always for the off-ramp, but maybe for the next step, if that makes sense. I think I'm probably speaking more to researchers, because it's really difficult to stay in these relationships. So I think we need better ways and better mechanisms and better structures to create. And I think that's what Kate was saying at the beginning about the architecture. So it enables those connections to be maintained without that everyday work of, you know, of doing that there are more formalized structures. So I think it's probably between deliberately kind of seeking evidence mosaics and having the structures to create an attention on those over longer periods of time.
Brilliant. Thanks, Hannah. We are rapidly running out of time. So just a brief final word from all of you, please. If you were asked to pick one thing that's most important for successful knowledge mobilisation, what would it be? Kate, you've unmuted, so let's go to you first.
I mentioned 3 core principles, that architecture that Hannah just mentioned. The second piece is very strong leadership across government, across universities, civil society, or wherever, really strong disruptive leadership to push and advocate for this work, because it is a new reality, because particularly for the universities, it is the reality, but we need to stop the initiative-itis. Yeah, what this needs is core, long-term, visionary, structural funding put in place to get real. I mean, and to keep the universities relevant on a rapidly changing rapidly changing landscapes.
Excellent. Thank you, Kate. Even more briefly, if you could, Ben.
People, just focus on the people, make sure the people stay in contact and organise the people.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Professionally or otherwise.
Thank you. Hannah.
Yeah, I agree with Kate. I think what we need to do is have a really deliberate conversation, you know, a really deliberate focus on the mechanisms that connect knowledge holders, including policy actors, to decision sites where we make decisions. So we really need to think about the mechanisms and the structures and the systems, and not just initiatives.
Excellent. Thank you all for being so brief and so to the point. We could have gone for, I think, another hour. This has been a fascinating discussion. Lots of interesting insights, and those points about people funding architecture, I think, point the way forward to embed knowledge mobilisation even more firmly in our research policy ecosystem. A huge thank you to Ben and to Kate and to Hannah for sharing their wisdom and insight with us, and a huge thank you to all of you for participating and asking such brilliant questions. Have a very lovely rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Just
Bye-bye.
one quick thing. Thanks to Sarah. Just thank you to Sarah for your leadership. I mean, you're a household name in many of the universities in Ireland for your leadership. So really, I think that needs to be acknowledged. And Sarah and Elliot, yours too. So
yeah.
Thanks. I'm sitting here blushing, but thank you, Kate. I appreciate that. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.